In this video, I'll provide an overview of our discussion board for creating and conducting a hypothesis test. You can always access our modules here on the left. You can also access the assignment in your to-do list. So I can see it right here, DB4. And then you can always scroll down to the module quick links and go to the week 12 module, which has our DB4 in it. So in chapter 9 last week, you learned about hypothesis testing, which we will continue to learn about and apply in these remaining chapters of the semester. So I'll go ahead and click on our DB4. So the task in this week's discussion board is to develop and conduct a hypothesis test using the Airbnb data set and your variables of interest. Please review chapter 9 as needed, and I'll show you how to work through the hypothesis testing in supplemental videos here. Note that when you are writing up your hypothesis test, you can use the math symbols using the insert math equation. Here, let me go ahead and hit reply. That looks like right here on the right, that's the insert math equation. But if it's too much trouble, you can always just type out the words that explain your hypothesis test. That's totally fine. Now, when you are doing your hypothesized test this week, you need to come up with a hypothesized value that is based on secondary research. It could be a conservative number or based on an expert opinion. So whether you're doing a hypothesis test of a mean or proportion, you need to come up with a hypothesized value of mu for your population mean or your p, your population proportion. These numbers should not come from the Airbnb data. They are independent of the Airbnb data that you are testing against. Your Airbnb data is your sample data. That's the sample data you're using to conduct the hypothesis test. Now, I have worksheets to help guide you. There's a worksheet for hypothesis test of a mean and a worksheet for hypothesis test of a proportion, and they are in Google Doc form that you can download and use it to guide your process. You only need to pick one hypothesis test for the project. If you want to try to do both for extra practice, you're welcome to, but it's not required. So here's the original post requirement. You're going to conduct a hypothesis test and share your calculations and results, and I'll walk you through my examples down below. You need to make sure to explain the components of your hypothesis test. That's the null and alternative hypotheses, the alpha level or significance level, the sample size, the population mean or proportion, the sample mean or sample proportion, and if applicable, the sample standard deviation, which only applies if you're doing a hypothesis test of a mean. In addition to offering your calculations and results, you need to explain the implications of your findings for your business. So explain the so what in terms of the decisions you are making for your business. Now for your peer post, that's 5 points. You're going to analyze and comment and check their calculations. Did they do it correctly? If you see an error, help them by offering the correction. If it's correct, tell them it's correct. I've got a list here of the different kinds of errors that might occur. Maybe they have the symbols set up wrong in their hypothesis test, or perhaps their critical values are incorrect, or they didn't calculate the test statistic correctly, or everything was set up, but then the final interpretation was a bit off, or their way they explained it wasn't clear, and its interpretation of how it impacts the business. So there's a lot of components, and you want to help each other by confirming and checking. And if you are able to find an error and help your peer correct it, I will, on top of the peer post points, offer an extra 5 extra credit points. I will also be verifying everyone's hypothesis tests and providing feedback directly into the discussion board. But this is just good practice for you to look at hypothesis testing from another angle. Not just from creating it, but also from checking one. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. Here is an example of a hypothesis test of a population mean that I have set up. You can click here on the link to watch the video where I show you the step-by-step instructions on how I go through it. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to give you an overview of my results and explaining it of what this would look like in your discussion board post. I am conducting a hypothesis test on the average price per night in Ville Marie, which is a neighborhood of Montreal. where I'm considering opening a bike and wine / beer tour. Specifically, I want to know if Villa Marie is greater or less than 181 Canadian dollars. Because I have done secondary research. I went to this website called budgetyourtrip.com and looked up what does it typically cost to stay in Montreal. And this 181 is the average price paid for a hotel room that's considered mid-range in Montreal. Now, again, I'm interested in a very specific neighborhood, Villa Marie, which resides in Montreal, the entire city. I have notated that my data is in Canadian dollars. So if you need to verify, you can always check in Canvas from the original data sets what currency you're in and make sure just to use that currency. You don't need to convert it. So now the reason why I'm choosing this hypothesis test is because I want to market my bike tour of wine bars and breweries in an upscale neighborhood. And I think Villa Marie might fit that description. And I want to see how it compares to Montreal as a whole. So I'm going to set this up as a two-tailed test because I don't know if Villa Marie is cheaper or more expensive than all of Montreal. So to be safe, I'm going to do the two-tailed hypothesis test. So I'm going to say my null hypothesis is that the population mean is equal to 181 Canadian dollars per night on average. And my alternative hypothesis states that the population mean does not equal to 181 Canadian dollars per night. And this does not could mean it's either less than or greater than, and I'll find out once I do my analysis. Now, I'm going to choose my alpha level, and I'm going to set it at 5% or 0.05. Recall, you get to decide what that alpha level is. It could be 1%, 2%, 10%, 5%. But 10% is usually as far as you go. And then my hypothesized population mean, that 181 that I have here, again, that came from a secondary source. That came from the internet, specifically a website. With my other variables, this came from my discussion board 3, right? I have a sample size of 1670. I have a sample mean of $230.92 in Canadian dollars. And I have a sample standard deviation of $232.77. All of this I have already from discussion board 3. I'm just plugging it in to figure out the hypothesis test. Now I used Excel to find what my critical t-value was, and it's plus or minus 1.96 because it's a two-tailed test. So I'm going to have a negative critical value of 1.96 and a positive value of 1.96. Now, I took all my data and I put it into the formula for a test statistic of a mean and found that my test statistic is 8.76. Now I have to interpret the results. I'm going to use the critical value method as well as the p-value approach because they should align. Because my test statistic of 8.76 is greater than my critical value of 1.96, and my p-value of 0.0000 is less than my alpha of 0.05, we will reject the null. So here's my null up here. I'm going to reject that top statement. And what that means is that the average price per night in Villa Marie is not 181 Canadian dollars. It's actually higher because my test statistic is greater. It's bigger than my critical value. It's way in the rejection region. So this is good. My interpretation then suggests from a business standpoint that, yeah, Villa Marie is upscale enough. It's more expensive than Montreal as a whole. And so I want to go ahead and open up my bike and wine and beer tour business in Villa Marie. For instance, if I had done my hypothesis test and it turns out that it was not, greater or on the higher end, maybe it was the same price as all of Montreal or less than the average price in Montreal, I can still open my business in Villa Marie, but I might have to tweak some things. Maybe because it's a mid-range, I can only charge mid-range for my tours. I wouldn't do a high end tour, and I would pick businesses on the tour route, the wine and beer businesses that are also in the mid-range, right? So I'm going to still make decisions based on my results, even if I reject or don't reject the null, but it should match. In this case, it is higher. So this is upscale. I can open my business here and I can charge on the higher end. and take folks to like higher end wine and beer businesses. Let's go ahead and scroll down and look at an example of a hypothesis test of a population proportion. Remember, proportions are just percentages. Again, I have a video that walks you through how to calculate and do the math behind it, but I'm going to explain the hypothesis test, and maybe this will be of interest to you. So I am conducting a hypothesis test on the proportion of listings in Villa Marie that are not instant bookable. So in my data set, the very last column or the very last variable is true and false, where it says, is this listing instant bookable or not? And so F is the category that I'm interested in, false, not instant bookable. Because what that means, the instant bookable allows people to book Airbnbs last minute without talking to a host. Whereas I'm interested in those that are not instant bookable, meaning these are the listings that require advanced bookings, reservations, talking to a host, a lot of planning that's going on. Specifically, I hypothesize that more than 50% of listings are not instant bookable. So I'm taking a bit of a gamble. I think it's going to be more than 50% that are not instant bookable. Just thinking about how vacations generally are. People, at least when you're traveling to someplace like Montreal, which is more of like a vacation destination place, I think it's going to involve advanced planning. So that's why I came up with this hypothesis. And I want to understand customer behavior as it relates to my business. Because if there are more not instant bookables, that means the majority of visitors plan the trips in advance and would likely book a bike and wine tour in advance as opposed to doing last minute reservations. So because I have this set up as a more than, this is going to be an upper tail test, and this is how I would write it up. For my, I'll start actually with the alternative because this is what I'm testing. The alternative hypothesis that I'm testing is that the population proportion of not instant bookable Airbnb listings is going to be greater than 0.5 or 50%. And then my null is just the opposite, which is the population proportion of not instant bookables is going to be less than or equal to 0.5. And now you might ask, where'd you get the 0.5 from? We learned about this in chapter 9 about being conservative. If you don't have an idea and you want to be conservative, just say that it's a 50-50 chance, right? 50% chance that it's instant bookable and 50% chance that it's not instant bookable. And so my hypothesized population proportion is based on a conservative approach. I did choose my same alpha level of 0.05 or 5%, just like I did in my other test. My sample size that I'm using to do this is the 1670. And I do have a sample proportion that I calculated of 0.5928. So I go out 4 decimal places for accuracy. But you might be wondering, where'd she get a sample proportion from? Well, I went into my data and I used pivot tables to do a bit of counting. And I counted how many Fs or not instant bookables there were in Villa Marie. There are 990. Out of all my listings of Villa Marie. So I had 1670 listings. So I just took my X divided by my N. And so I show you how to do that in the worksheet. And hopefully this is familiar because you learned about it in chapter 9, how a proportion works. But I just used my data set to find the X and the N. In my video, I also show you a couple other categories or characteristics or X's that you might be interested that are useful to your business. So make sure to watch the video because instant bookable might not make sense for your business. Now, to find the critical Z value, I used Excel, and the worksheets that I provide and the videos show you how to do that. And then I took my information and I plugged it into the test statistic formula for a proportion and converted it to a test statistic. In this case, when I did my math, I got a test statistic of 7.58. And so now I'm going to come up with a conclusion using both the critical value approach and the p-value approach. Because my test statistic Z is 7.58, which is greater than my critical value of 1.645, and my p-value, 0.000, is less than the alpha of 0.05, we reject the null. which means, so if I'm rejecting the null, imagine I'm crossing out that top sentence and just keeping the alternative hypothesis. So that means that the proportion of listings that are not instant bookables is greater than 0.5 or 50% in Ville Marie, which means that yes, greater than 50% or the majority of visitors do plan in advance and book their Airbnbs in advance, and they're not like last minute sudden bookings. And so for my business, I should also require advanced reservations for my tours. And I wouldn't necessarily do last minute bookings because they're not the majority of what's happening with my Airbnb data. So this is great because this is going to help me manage how many bikes I need if I have all the reservations in advance. I can plan accordingly on the stops along my tour and work with those different businesses to schedule them when I need to because I know the dates and I know the group sizes already. And then I can also budget my business sales because I'll have an idea of how many tours I'm doing any given week and who's in it and the size. So this is great for planning purposes. Now, on the flip side, if it turns out it was not greater than 50%, maybe it was less than and it didn't work out, then I would have to change my business strategy of allowing for last minute bookings. And then now I'd have to maybe even turn away or reject people if I didn't have enough bikes, and maybe find businesses for my tour that are okay with last minute drop-ins and tours and things like that. So I would make different business decisions if my outcome was different. But that's where it's really important that we're able to connect the statistical results to a business decision. And so if we scroll down below, you'll be putting all of that into a discussion board post and then being able to talk that through in your groups. And if you have any questions, feel free to schedule student office hours with me. If you want to send me your hypothesis test in advance before you post, I'm happy to take a look at that. Let me know if you need anything at all.